Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Melody Fox Ahmed. I'm the Assistant Director for Programs here at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And it is our pleasure and our honor to welcome you to this very special event tonight, the Education and Social Justice Summer Research Presentations from 2015. Yes, we're already in 2016. It's already February. They did this work half a year ago, but we like to say that this is not just a summer fellowship. It's not just a 3-week jaunt to some fabulous locale. It's actually a 1-year, very intensive research project that our fellows engage in. You'll see them seated up here at the front. We have Dana Drecksel, who is in South Korea. We have Sabrina Khan, who is in Senegal. We have Nicolas Lake, who is in Guatemala. And we have Snell, who was in Canada. So we selected these lovely young people last spring, worked intensively with them on research practices, interview practices, preparing for the particular local host society that they would be in. They developed a research question. They talked to faculty. They talked to people who were working on the ground. And then they went off in the summer, did their research, and then when they came back, they wrote a report, a case study, which forms this lovely publication, hot off the presses. So take a look at that. They took beautiful photos. We organized a photo exhibit, and then they put together a presentation, which you will see tonight. So this was their work over the entire past year. We're extremely proud of them. This is a very competitive fellowship, I want to emphasize. We only choose about 4 fellows. We get dozens and dozens and dozens of applications for this. We would, love to be able to send more. So if any of you would like to fund a student, please talk to me. And right now, we are going into our 7th year. So this was our 6th cohort. Our 7th year cohort, I'm really thrilled to see. 4 of them are right here. The 5th one is actually a student from Georgetown in Doha, Qatar. So we're very excited to have an international student. So we're right now working on where we're going to send our fellows this year. They're going to be listening very attentively and thinking of serious questions to ask you all. So we're looking forward to that. And really this project, I think, is one of our signature our key programs that the Berkeley Center and the Center for Social Justice, Research, and Teaching puts on together. It's very much a partnership. My colleague, Dr. Andrea Whistler, who's seated here, is going to share a few words in a moment from her perspective about this project. It's a serious opportunity for undergraduate students to do research and to be published. And that's something that we believe in very deeply, both of our centers, that students should be producers and not just consumers of knowledge. So they really have this opportunity to do the research in a very serious way and present it and share it with all of you. So we thank you for being here. We're excited to see what they've learned. It's really highlighting some very innovative best practices in education that helps marginalized communities around the world. And you can look on the website and see the work of the past 6 years. It's very impressive, over 22 countries. We're trying not to repeat countries, so it's kind of like, where are we going to send these guys next? And we'd love you all to read the interviews, read the case studies, comment to us, and spread the word among your friends and colleagues as well. So Dr. Whistler will say a few words, and then we will hear from our fellows. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melody. As Melody said, my name is Andrea Whistler, and I serve as Executive Director of the Center for Social Justice, Research, Teaching, and Service here at Georgetown. I'm also a professor in our program on justice and peace. The Education and Social Justice Project, I really think, is maybe the best and most compelling example of what Georgetown University's president, Jack DeGioia, has been talking a lot about in the last few years. That the role of the university is 1, for research, 2, for student formation, and 3, for the common good. And this project single-handedly puts those 3 responsibilities of the university together in what I like to think is a very fun, adventurous, and enriching program. So I'm thrilled to be a part of something that is so close to the university's mission. It is really one of the most amazing ways that we use the resources of the university towards the common good. So what are some of those resources? First, our Jesuit and faith-based connections around the world. As you'll hear from our student researchers tonight, they spend time with the most generous of hosts from various religious denominations, and we're incredibly thankful for those individuals and communities around the world. Second, as Melody mentioned, one of our resources is our donor relations. This is a donor-funder project, and we're very appreciative of our donor, Rodney Jacob, for really supporting this program through and through, and for the publication of what you have in front of you. And third, probably our richest resource here is our human capacity. And in this case, that's our amazing student researchers, Nico, Caitlin, Sabrina, and Dana. These 4 students, I have to tell you, have proved their critical thinking skills, their quick thinking skills in many cases, have shown their commitment to education and social justice, their creativity, and coming from a professor who teaches research methods, the most unbelievable power to really listen to the people who are sharing their stories with them. So I'm so thrilled that you get to be here to listen, to hear them kind of come alive with the stories from South Korea and Father Park to Miguel in Guatemala. And I hope that you get to listen and read some more of the stories that are online. I also believe that this project is a great example of how Georgetown as a Jesuit university responds to what Father Peter Kolvenbach called the need for students to experience and to get to face nitty-gritty realities around the world. As you heard from Melody, we are not sending these students to stay in the Ritz, believe me. And they really come in contact with what is the diversity of human experience around the world, and then they bring it here to us and to everybody who reads and listens to the stories online. So we're very thankful to our student researchers for all of the work that you put into this and your willingness to share with us tonight. So I'm going to bring up our first student researcher. Each student will be talking between 8 and 10 minutes. We're going to have Q&A at the end of the 4 presentations, so start noting your grilling questions now for them, okay? And our first researcher of the evening is Caitlin, and Caitlin's going to be bringing us up north to the Inuit territories of Canada. Thank you, Caitlin. Here. Okay. Hi, my name is Caitlin Snell, and I am a senior in the college, majoring in sociology and minoring in education, inquiry, and justice. And today I will be talking to you about my trip all the way up to Canada, where I focused on cultural education for Native populations in Manitoulin Island and the North Shore. So Manitoulin Island, you can see there, is located in Lake Huron, and the North Shore is just the coast above it. I stayed in Espanola, and I will talk about my site in a few minutes. And I worked with 6 First Nations that inhabit the island itself, and 2 who are in the North Shore and neighboring area. So I stayed at the Anishinaabe Spiritual Center, which is a Jesuit spiritual location that was founded in 1972 that focuses on bridging the gaps on providing a space for spiritual awakening and fulfillment for Native populations as well as non-Native populations. So it's a very inclusive space. Everyone is welcome, and they recognize the challenging past that Catholicism has had with Native populations, and so focusing on reconciliation between the communities, as you can see in their vision statement, I believe is really powerful. And it was a wonderful space. Everyone was extremely helpful, and I will talk about some of my first few experiences with them and then the neighboring communities that I worked with as well. So after arriving at the center, I learned a little bit more about the history of the area and the residential school system, which functioned from 1831 to 1996 across Canada. And this was a network of residential boarding schools for the assimilation of First Nation children into mainstream Canadian culture, was meant to teach children how to kind of navigate the social milieu of Canada, give them specific skills so that they could be successful in typical Canadian life. It was implemented by churches and funded by the government. Unfortunately, it led to an aggressive civilization strategy and kind of forced children to be removed from their communities, and they were abused when practicing aspects of their traditional culture, couldn't speak their traditional language, and when I was interviewing people, they often referenced it as a form of cultural genocide because it prevented that generation from learning about their culture and being connected with that identity, therefore also impacting the children who are currently in those communities because they don't have as many people to teach them what it's like to be Anishinaabe. So the photo, Levi Southwind, he attended a residential school and as an example, and so I met with him and his family and kind of talked about that history as well and what work they're doing in the communities to rebuild some of that cultural knowledge. So continuing with my data collection, I interviewed teachers, administrators, spiritual leaders. This is a photo of one of the first places that I visited, which was a Catholic parish in Chaging First Nation, which is on the island. And I noticed a lot of different aspects inside of this church that I wouldn't see in Dahlgren Chapel or wouldn't see in a typical church simply because of the traditional Native aspects. So they had giant leather gowns on the priests as well as on the altars. They had imagery that was depicting Natives as Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ. They had a smudge, which was these kind of 4 traditional medicines that would fill the room with a specific scent and atmosphere to promote a spiritual cleansing, native woodwork, all of these different aspects that I wouldn't typically see. And so I was wondering how the church was able to pair these kind of seamless aspects of both traditional Catholic traditions and cultural aspects, as well as the native traditional aspects. And so then thinking more and asking more questions about what those aspects are and how they're doing that. So they focused a lot on the common themes, both the people in the church, in the schools, the various programs that I interviewed focused a lot on language, rebuilding and reintegrating the native Ojibwe language, as well as the spiritual teachings. So recognizing that Catholicism and the native spiritual teachings don't have to be mutually exclusive and finding a balance between those two, as well as creating culturally grounded learners, making sure that individuals are being educated in a very strong foundation with who they are and what it's like to be native, and recognizing the differences between various cultures and being confident with their individuality. So those are some of the content aspects that I recognized as patterns between the different interviews, and then to continue with the methods of how this was integrated into the programs. I found a lot of different aspects of community engagement. So there were a lot of powwows between reservations. The schools would put on their own powwows. So below is one at On Deck Omniconning, which I attended, and they had tons of merchandise for sale. They had various dances and everyone was allowed to participate. You didn't have to be of the culture or of a First Nation. They tried to pull me on. I was like, yeah, sure, let's go. And I danced for a little bit, but not too long. But it was a wonderful time for anyone in the community, anyone in the area to really participate. And so bridging those gaps, and the children especially had a fun time really noticing what it was like for the parents to be involved and kind of bridging the gaps between the youth and the elders. So youth programs, Karen Corbier-Genereux is the program director for a youth justice program in Chaging as well. And so focusing on making sure that students have some cultural knowledge and aren't engaging in disrespectful acts in their communities, and building kind of a stronger foundation for who they are and that community respect. As well as focusing on elder teachings and bringing elders into the classroom and into the various youth programs to bridge those gaps between the people who did not attend residential schools with the students who were just now going through school and learning, and kind of bridging the difference between either the parents who may be of that generation who didn't get all that cultural knowledge, the elders, and then the children, and finding a balance between all three of those. As well as community values. So there were some schools that are what we would probably call a charter school, or a smaller network of schools, and they worked as a community to build their core values for the classrooms and for the schools. And so really making sure that they are sensitive to the history that families may have had with education systems in the past, and really ensuring that everyone is involved in the conversation. Oh, that's a little cut off. But for cultural identity, this was another way that schools and various institutions really focused on making sure that students were being involved and able to build solidarity and reconciliation. So recognizing the past, what had happened to their communities, what had happened to other situations of cultural genocide, as they called it, and making sure that they are able to progress and move forward as a community or as individuals and be confident learners in that sense. So also focusing on social and emotional learning, balancing what it's like to learn about your culture in the classroom at the same time as building literacy or building math skills, and as well as how to connect with other people and communicate efficiently and use empathy and learning about your culture as well as other people's cultures. So improving confidence and self-esteem, having kind of a resiliency toolbox, a personal toolbox, creating confident lifelong learners, ensuring that they're confident and, sorry, I should repeat myself, that they have cultural foundations and are ensuring holistic development of who they are as a whole person, so educating the whole child, and that Jesuit value was present everywhere. For Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous People, this was a tapestry in one of the schools that I visited that was hanging in the hallway, and the teachers referenced it a lot to ensure that the students are recognizing who they are as a people and the strength that they have and who they matter as a community. So just to summarize, the historical context of the region led to a resurgence of cultural education in these institutions, whether that was a spiritual institution, an academic institution, a social justice kind of youth program as well. And they all focused on these aspects through community engagement and ensuring that they were building a strong cultural identity to create holistic development for these individuals as well as their community. Thank you. Which first? No, I'm done. Thank you, Caitlin. Our next student researcher is Nicolas Lake, and he is going to be taking us to Guatemala. And I just also wanted to mention that later in the summer, it was August, right guys? Yeah. I actually got to travel with Nico and Caitlin to Nicaragua. So we actually had a lot of great experiences this summer, really being kind of on the ground in new places, and I really appreciated them being awesome travel companions and doing our work there at the university in Managua. So, Nico.
Awesome. Great. So like Andrea said, I was in Guatemala, and I am Nico Lake, a senior here in the SFS. And in Guatemala, the main thing I was studying was the Development with Justice Scholarship program. And that program is put on by the Universidad Rafael Landívar, which is in Guatemala City. And the program primarily targets low-income Guatemalans, and specifically females and indigenous peoples. So while I was there, the research question that I formulated was the impact of the Development of Justice Scholarship on the lives of Guatemalans and at the university? So this university is the only Jesuit university in Guatemala, which is how Georgetown and the Berkeley Center were able to partner with it. And the university has kind of a unique system in that there's a central campus in Guatemala City and then a number of rural campuses spread around Guatemala. So during the week, I was at the central campus in Guatemala City, and then on weekends, I was fortunate enough to travel to some of the rural campuses. So I went to Huehuetenango, which is the tough word to pronounce in the front, then Coban and Zacapa. And then the last thing I really want to mention at the start is that none of this would have been possible without Miguel, who is on the far left of the photo here, and he works at the university in the dean's office, and he was kind of my everything down there. He helped with travel, with formulating my research question, and with finding people to interview. So he was huge for my whole project. So to kind of ground you in where I was, you can see Guatemala City there, starred in bold. That's where I spend most of my time during the week. And then I was able to travel to some of the campuses. You see Huehuetenango up in the northwest, then Coban and Zacapa. So I traveled to each of those on sequential weekends. Now a little background on why the scholarship specifically targeted females and indigenous people. Both of them have a history of marginalization in Guatemala. For the indigenous people, they comprise about 40% of Guatemala's population, which is a much larger percent than many countries. But still, they face a lot of discrimination, especially during the Civil War in Guatemala, which went from 1960 to 1996. They're the targets of a lot of violence and displacement. That unfortunately has continued to today, where they are underrepresented in a lot of positions, whether it be government or positions of influence, power, or wealth. And for women, it's a similar story. A lot of Latin America has a machismo culture that is kind of a patriarchal society that puts the man first, where the men are expected to be the breadwinners and are expected to be the ones who eat first, get the privileges in the house, and this is still very present in Guatemala. And then the last aspect kind of that the scholarship was trying to target was education in rural areas. So in Guatemala, as in every other country, development lags behind in rural areas. This means worsened access to a lot of resources, such as health clinics, social services, and universities. It also means things like high literacy rates. So in the communities I was working with, the illiteracy rate was usually around 40 to 50%. To kind of give some voices to some people I was interviewing, I have a couple quotes. So the first one is from Juan, one of the people I interviewed, and his quote, "I haven't seen a minister of education who is indigenous. The government and power is centralized, so indigenous people don't have positions and are lacking in most areas. The government, beginning from the executive branch, discriminates against indigenous, so there isn't room for us." And then Gloria, the quote on the bottom, "When a girl is born, the father says the girl will grow up to cook, to make food for the men. The inequality begins then. They say you can't. The dad is the first one. It's in everything I've seen. For example, when you're eating, the first that gets served is the man. The mom can exhibit machismo also." So these are just some of the quotes to kind of show you the marginalization that these populations do go through. So moving on to kind of the university and my studying, here are some pictures of a couple of the rural campuses that I went to. As you can tell, they look a lot different from Georgetown, right? They're a lot smaller, generally one-story buildings, and a lot greener as well. So these campuses were built through the development of Justice Scholarship. And the scholarship came about in 2006 when a German development bank, which is abbreviated KfW, reached out to the university and said they wanted to improve educational development in Guatemala. And the way they decided on was through the scholarship program. So the first component of the scholarship program was infrastructure. So these universities, if you were there 10 years ago, they would have just been plots of land, and now there's about 8 across Guatemala that they've built. The other component, which is continuing to this day, is student scholarships. So they fund students, everything, their travel, housing, food, and then their matriculation costs and all school expenses to attend the university. A lot of the students, or all the students, come from low-income communities, so they have to work most of the week, and then they're only able to take classes on Friday or Saturday. Depending on the coursework, they'll take class once a day, twice a day. And so the two main questions that I really looked at when interviewing the students was, is the scholarship a work of charity or a social justice? And then, has the education given you a capacity for critical analysis? So in class at Georgetown, we talk a lot about reflection and not just what you're learning, but why you're learning what you're learning. So we want to see if that carried on to the Jesuit institution down in Guatemala. So the main form of communicating with these students was through these interviews. I held about a dozen or so with groups of students, anywhere from 4 to 8 students in the rural campuses, and these were awesome. They really gave me a chance to reach out to students and connect with them and hear their experiences both at the university as well as the communities from where they're from and their plans and goals for the future. These are some various pictures from my different interviews. So the influence of the scholarship. The scholarship is a very powerful experience in the lives of these people. To represent that, I have 2 quotes, and I'll talk a little more about it. So the first quote from Domingo says, "The scholarship has provided plenty of help to me, so I can continue with a major that I like, which is criminal forensics. I chose the major because I'm interested in it, and I've seen the need for it in my community." And then the second quote, "I want to graduate from the university and work in a job related to health in a community with scarce resources." So as you can tell with these students, the community is a very big factor of it. When I visited this house, this is Luis, he's a scholarship student from Huehuetenango, and we went to his house and we drove by car. It took us about 2 hours. For him, it usually takes about 3.5 hours because he has to take a couple buses, which is pretty normal. People take public transportation, it takes a while. But it's very clear when we were going through his community that he was a well-known figure in the community, waved to a lot of people, he was clearly well recognized. And a lot of people echo this sentiment of wanting to give back to the community. So the impact of the scholarships. A lot of the students really considered it a transformative personal experience. The students were generally either the only student or one of the only students from the community who had reached a university level of education. There is primary and secondary levels, but then once you get to tertiary and university levels, it's pretty rare, especially in rural areas. Agents of change is a term that came up pretty often in discussions, and that's the idea that these students aren't just receiving the education for themselves, but they're doing it for their families especially, and then for the communities. And so they talked about setting up health clinics in the communities or doing social work, that sort of job. And then they really considered the scholarship an act of social justice. So they considered it providing opportunity to this sector of the population that previously didn't have these opportunities for whatever reasons. And then in terms of critical analysis and whether this spirit of reflection and of focusing on why you're doing what you're doing that we really harp on here at Georgetown, they really had a similar thing in their classes. And when we discuss social issues, education, gender issues, they're really able to discuss them with some good knowledge and analysis. So looking towards the future for farther research questions, we were only there for a few weeks. It would be really cool to, look more into it. So the program just started in 2006, and unlike us, many of them go to school for more than 4 years, since they're only able to attend classes once a week. So it usually can take 6 to 7, 8 years. So the first class of students actually only graduated a couple years ago. So what change does the program have for the students post-graduation, and how much have their lives changed with this degree? Is the program sustainable? I didn't mention it much in my presentation, but I spent a lot of time there looking at the finances of it and whether a program like this is sustainable, because it is subsidized with the central campus paying for a lot of the rural campuses, as well as the money from the German Development Bank. And then is this applicable to other countries? I have Latin American there because Guatemala is a Latin American country and it's the best model for it. The German Development Bank has reached out to El Salvador, and they are starting a program there. So it will be moving to El Salvador. Guatemala was the first case, the pilot, and so it'll be interesting to see how it works when it moves to other countries. And then a thank you. Again, Miguel was awesome. I also worked with Dinora, who is a university contact there, a ton, and the whole university was very great in hosting me. And then to the Berkeley Center and Melody and Andrea, thanks a lot.
Our fourth presentation brings us to Senegal. So Sabrina, thank you so much.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina, and I'll be discussing interreligious dialogue in Catholic education in Catholic schools in Senegal. So before beginning, I just want to say thank you to Andrea and Melody for all of their support and guidance with my project. I also want to say thank you to Lauren Herzog, who's an employee at the Berkeley Center, who actually visited Dakar for a couple of days while I was there, and she was always more than happy to offer guidance whenever I asked her. And I also want to thank the community at ONEX and the CFP, particularly Brother Jean-Marie Thior, for his incredible hospitality. So just as an introduction, I conducted most of my research in Dakar. Which is the capital of Senegal. There I interviewed teachers, administrators, and students about their perspectives on the Catholic education system. I also spent 1 week in Mbour at the CFP, which stands for the Centre de Formation Pédagogique, where many Catholic teachers are trained. And there's also an elementary school where many of the trainees teach at. So because my project focuses on religious education, I'll briefly provide an overview of the religious demographics of Senegal. So 94% of Senegalese citizens practice Islam, with most Muslims belonging to one of several Sufi brotherhoods. 4% practice Christianity. The vast majority are Roman Catholic, with a minority Protestant presence. and 2% practice indigenous religions. But animism also influences the way many Senegalese practice Islam and Christianity too. So I'll just give a brief historical context of the Catholic education system in Senegal. So it was established by French colonists and modeled after the French system. So French is still the official language of the public education system as well as the private Catholic education system. Senegal officially secularized its education system in 1904 following France's decision to secularize its public education system. Now, however, a lot of my research over the summer, I found that a lot of Catholic schools are trying to make it easier for students who have difficulty adapting to the French usage in the school systems. And so I encountered one project called Project Emile, for example, which incorporates a student's maternal language in the curriculum. So this isn't something that I addressed in my presentation, but it is something that I mentioned in my paper. In the 1970s, 7 dioceses were created to better serve schools at a regional level. And just for some basic statistics, according to one interviewee, nearly 20% of Senegalese children are educated in the Catholic system, which is a lot. And 75% of those students in the Catholic education system are Muslim. So clearly there's a lot of interesting interreligious dynamics that I'll be discussing. So for the history of ONEX, so in 2003, ONEX was created to coordinate education at the national level. So ONEX stands for l'Office National de l'Enseignement Catholique du Sénégal, which translates to the National Office of Catholic Teaching of Senegal. So that was created to nationally coordinate activities across the 7 dioceses of Senegal. So private Catholic education consists of preschool, elementary, middle, and secondary levels. Additionally, many schools offer technical and professional training for those who decide not to attend university. ONEX is led by its national secretary, Brother Jean-Marie Thior. He's held that position for the past 4 years. So even though it's not a Jesuit organization, I found that ONEX emphasizes an idea that's very similar to Cura Personalis, that is education of the whole person. So ONEX's mission is the education of tout homme et tout l'homme, which I best translate to all people and all of the person. So that means an education of certain social values linked to being a responsible citizen, not just teaching students how to pass their final exams. It also means educating Christian students about the values of the Catholic faith and non-Christian students about universal moral values, and all students about what it means to be a responsible Senegalese citizen. So some of my research questions going into the summer were, how does ONEX's mission reflect particular Catholic values? How does its mission affect interreligious dynamics among students? And ultimately, what makes the Catholic education system so attractive to Muslim families? Because as I mentioned, about 1 in 5 children are educated in the system, yet 94% of the population in Senegal is Muslim. So what makes it so attractive? So there are a lot of themes that I found throughout my interviews. The first thing that nearly every interviewee mentioned was the academic rigor and discipline. So almost every single person mentioned the fact that strikes are banned in the Catholic education system, and those occur very often in the public education system, as I was told. So what I gathered from my interviews is that they're viewed as unproductive and disruptive for obvious reasons, but they're also wrong because teachers are considered to be abandoning their students if they engage in strikes. However, workers' rights are an important Catholic cause, and that was something that was also mentioned in my interviews. I did interview the head of the teachers union for ONEX, and she works to secure housing for teachers, which is one of the many goals of the unions. That is additionally an important cause for ONEX. Academic results and teachers' qualifications are very important to the hiring processes in the schools. And discipline was also an important theme I found. If students answer a question wrong in class, some teachers will have the student remain standing for the rest of the class. So that was an important theme I also found. So I also want to discuss with you religious freedom and tolerance and solidarity. So religious freedom is very important. That was something that I found throughout my interviews. So one director of a primary school remarked that prayers are not done, in her words, prayers are not done in an ostentatious way, so as to not put any students who might not be Christian to put them off. So even though every school day opens with a prayer, students can arrive at school after the prayer. They're not obligated to participate in any of the Catholic customs. So solidarity was a big theme that I discussed at length in my paper, but I'll just present some highlights with you today that I do discuss at greater length in the paper. So as I said, students are not forced to pray. There's also a very strong emphasis on teacher-student relationships. So some of the students that I interviewed told me that they view their professors as family members, or they'll view other students as family members. And professors make a point to always be available outside of the normal school hours to discuss personal issues with their students as well, not just academic concerns. And some of the students I interviewed mentioned to me that they view themselves as representatives of the school, and that affects their beliefs about how one should act as a citizen of Senegal, not just as a student of that school. Another interesting thing I found was that in terms of solidarity, so I stayed at a monastery in Dakar, and some of the nuns I lived with actually work as teachers. And so some of them told me that they view forbidding the veil in Catholic schools as also an instance of solidarity, because you can't tell which students are Muslim and Christian, and all students also wear a uniform in school. So this is an interesting question for religious freedom, but many of the people I interviewed said that that was an instance of solidarity, because you can't tell what religion the student actually is, so they're all treated the same in the eyes of the administrators and teachers. However, it should be noted that I don't have a perspective from female Muslim students or how a ban on the veil affects enrollment in Catholic schools, if it does at all. Another interesting thing I found was that students are encouraged to wish each other happy Ramadan and to make a point of celebrating each other's holidays. So one quote that I want to share with you today is from Brother Jean-Marie Thior, and I'll just read that out to you. The dialogue in our schools permits people to know the religion of someone else and to also recognize the person himself and to respect him within his religion. At school, you frequently hear students wish each other happy Eid, Ramadan, Christmas, Easter, Tabaski, which is what they call Eid al-Adha in Senegal. He goes on to say that Muslim-Christian dialogue is also a social dialogue, living together, working together for the development of the country, sharing together joyous and unfortunate events, and uniting for good causes. And then another quote that I want to share with you on the importance of interreligious dialogue. So that's a picture of Brother Jean-Marie Thior, and as I mentioned, he is the National Secretary of ONEX. So he told me that parents are also very happy to enroll their children because our school symbolizes a place of Muslim-Christian dialogue, because we allow youth of different religions to be able to live together. So in this way, the Catholic school settings prepare students to live in a pluralist country as responsible citizens, and the school setting itself is intended to serve as a way to practice diversity in action. And so I do also want to briefly discuss opportunities for expansion and improvement that a lot of my interviewees mentioned to me. So Brother Thior, for example, mentioned that he very much hopes to expand the outreach of the Catholic schools in Senegal. And so one way of doing that would be to provide more scholarships for students who can't afford the tuition. That is something that many of the schools are trying to do, but resources are indeed limited. He also hopes to make accommodations for deaf and mute children, and they are trying to build more schools in Dakar for students with certain disabilities that are unable to participate in a lot of the curriculum. And then lastly, I want to just discuss with you some project limitations and avenues for future research. So it should be noted that I did only interview one Muslim student, so in the future it would be very valuable to interview Muslim families. I think it would also be valuable and insightful to interview parents who deliberately decided against enrolling their children in the Catholic education system, because while my interviews were very eye-opening, I did only interview stakeholders in the Catholic education system, and I don't necessarily have viewpoints of people who don't have that same vested interest in it. And in terms of questions for future research, I think it would be very interesting to look at Quranic schools in Senegal, private Quranic schools, and see how their mission also affects their curriculum, because I think that would shed a lot of light on whether there is something attributable to a larger Senegalese culture that influences academics in the country rather than a particular religion itself. So that was a brief overview of my research, and I look forward to hearing your questions and feedback during the Q&A.
Okay, so I'm going to invite our 4 researchers to pull up their chairs to the front here. I'm going to ask the first question so that I give all of you in the audience a minute or two to start developing your own very challenging, difficult, hard questions. So actually my question is something I didn't hear, I don't think I heard anybody talk about, and it's something that usually does come up, and that is of language. And I'm really interested to hear about how you worked with the language in your local context. Did you speak the local language? Did you do your interviews in that language? Did you use translators? What was that experience like for you? Maybe to be doing research in a different language that than we use here, or just in a space where maybe the kind of the discourse is really just different. So does anyone want to start off with addressing issues of language in their research?
I can start. So I went to South Korea and I do not speak Korean. I assumed when I was going to Seoul that I think more people would speak English, but that is something that I definitely learned while I was there, is not a lot of people speak English. And so I had a few English contacts because we were specifically going through the Office of International Affairs at Sogang. That was great because in some of my interviews there, or most of my interviews there were with people who did not speak any English, and so I did use a translator. Sometimes, or every interview is different. So like I had one interview where we had a translator, but then sometimes she'd talk to me in English and then sometimes she'd talk to the translator, So very different experiences. But then when I went to Gangjang Village, almost nobody speaks English there. So it was really just trying to get through with, doing the best you could with body language, and then also just, forming short sentences and helping them come up with words to get around. But yeah, that was one of the most challenging, but yeah, one of the most, I guess, eye-opening experiences of like just being able to communicate with one another and how important that is.
Thanks, Dana.
So I actually conducted all of my research in French, and so I was actually surprised to find that in my entire 3 weeks in Senegal, I didn't meet a single person who spoke English. So I was really surprised to learn actually because I spent 2 weeks in Dakar, which is the capital, and there are many English speakers there, but I didn't come across anyone who spoke English. But I thought it was very helpful to be able to speak French with the people I interviewed. Even learning things like, for example, ONEX's mission statement, how to say that in French. I feel like that's a lot more insightful than trying to get some kind of translation. Then you can get to the heart of a lot of meaning behind what they're doing. So,
Thanks.
Yeah, so like Sabrina, all of my interviews were conducted in Spanish, and I do speak Spanish, so I was able to conduct them all and to talk to all of the interviewees. And also Sabrina, I was surprised by how few people spoke English. Miguel spoke English, so he was there if I ever needed it, but really none of the interviewees spoke any English, and then only some university officials spoke some English. And then also for the home visits I did do, in these indigenous populations, a lot of them speak languages other than Spanish, and that's the first native language. And I obviously didn't speak any of those, so when I did go to the homes, I would hear languages that were different than Spanish, and so it's usually the student who was being educated would be able to speak Spanish, but maybe the rest of his or her family wouldn't be able to, so I would have to communicate only with that student.
Thanks.
So I went to Canada and everyone spoke English, but I did face a couple of different social barriers as a non-native, non-Canadian individual. I thought that saying, oh, I'm coming from Georgetown, I want to do research, it's all contributing to social justice and to understand education in this community. There was still a lot of backlash from a couple of different individuals. I would call various interviewees and they'd say, yeah, sure, come on by, tomorrow we'll chat, and then I would drive with my host for 2 hours to get there, and they would say, oh, you're not native, we're not comfortable with this, which is understandable, but having to kind of navigate those situations and recognize the challenges of not being from that community and wanting to contribute positively still wasn't necessarily acceptable for them, and having to navigate those situations.
Great, thank you all for responding. Okay, I'm going to turn it to our audience. I think Jonathan has the first question. Can you introduce yourself and then state your question?
Jonathan Thrall, I'm the junior in the Colt major in SFS. I'm an ESJ fellow for this summer. Thank you for your presentations. It was also interesting to like sort of project myself perhaps this summer. So I have a question that bounces off this last one and what you said. what were maybe what was for each of you like the biggest obstacle in the interviews, or perhaps like I guess the whole project and the whole experience. But I'm thinking more about the interviews and what might have come up, what was difficult, maybe sort of communicating and really, if you're talking about certain personal experiences, getting across that and really coming to know the person that you're on your interviewees.
Sure. Thank you for your question, and I'm very excited to hear what your research is like next year. I think for me, having to deal with a kind of scarring historical context for that community and the communities that I worked with was being very sensitive and being very aware of my questions and making sure that they were relevant but also appropriate, and kind of testing the waters and asking the right probing questions so that they felt comfortable trusting me and trusting the Berkeley Center and Georgetown and the Center for Social Justice with the research. And so building those relationships and asking, is there someone else that I should talk to as well, and kind of snowballing from those situations, and just really being in that experience and really being empathetic and recognizing what that situation must be like for those individuals, as well as being analytical at the same time and kind of balancing what all of that means for your research.
Thanks for the question. So for me, the toughest part was getting the interviewees to, in a sense, say the truth. And so I had spoken with a lot of university officials, and they said that German Development Bank agents do come and they go to rural campuses and they interview students also. And with them, it's very much that the interviewees just say, oh, we're thankful for the program and we really appreciate everything it's done. It's a very happy picture. And so I was trying to ensure that I didn't just get that happy picture, and I really got whether there was some conflict at the campus they were at, what the difficulties of their lives were, and what the problems with the scholarship were. And so I was very open to them and their ability to criticize the program and say that things aren't all peachy and good, and really speak how they feel.
For me, I definitely think the biggest obstacle was knowing what the right questions were to ask during the interviews. So many of the people I interviewed had such a great insight, but you can't just say like, so tell me about yourself, and then expect to get some great story. You have to know exactly what to ask. And so many times after the interview, I would stop recording and then I would just say something, and then all of a sudden they would tell me this great story. And then I would wish that I kept the recorder on to hear it. But then my next interview, I would have that question in mind, and I'd be a little bit more prepared for the interview right after that. So I think the biggest learning curve for me was knowing which questions to ask and which would get the best responses.
Great question. I would say for me, one of the biggest challenges was also just a cultural difference that I noticed when I was there. In South Korea, things are very, very structured. So for instance, when I was trying to schedule my interviews, I had them all scheduled before I left per their request, and they all wanted me to email them the questions I was going to ask so they would know exactly what they wanted to say. And then over the course of my research, scheduling kind of changed a little bit, and so then I was just trying to schedule some more interviews and just realizing that there's this culture thing of like, I hadn't scheduled this out several weeks in advance, and even though they might be available tomorrow or the next day, that doesn't mean they're available to speak with me. And so that was something that was a bit challenging to navigate.
Great question. Okay. Yeah, Carolyn.
I'm wondering how
Can you introduce yourself, Carolyn?
Oh, I'm
Sorry.
Carolyn Bilter. I'm a junior in the college, and I will be a fellow next year as well, or this summer. And I was wondering how familiar you all were with the topics you ended up researching beforehand, and how you think that like affected your ability to really engage with your research.
I can start again. So I'm in the education minor at Georgetown, and my professor is here as well, who taught me about culturally relevant pedagogy. Thank you, Sabrina Khan. And so I had a little bit of an understanding of what cultural education was, and kind of understanding how to balance that in the classroom, educating the whole child as part of my Jesuit education experience at Georgetown. Not necessarily with residential schools in Canada, and even though that's not the most distinct or different country from the United States, it was still a very different situation that I was not used to, and so doing more research on that context. But in terms of the actual kind of situation for people who were experiencing residential schools as well as the cultural education in the classroom. It was a balance of what I had learned without any type of context. So adding the theory and what I had experienced in a school in DC and then applying it to a school in Canada and what that meant for that specific population or that specific community, and kind of finding those common links while ensuring that I was being specific to recognizing what was going on in that certain situation. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't have much experience with my topic going in. I had never heard of the university, much less the scholarship program, before I went. But I found out about the topic before going, and I have some familiarity in Latin American countries and with the universities there, and a lot of them are very similar. And so I was able to learn from that. And then I did a lot of research going in about the university, its system, its design, and then also the scholarship program, as well as the historical background that I mentioned a little bit of for both the indigenous peoples and then women in Guatemala, which really was able to help me kind of get a background and a setting for what the research was going to be about.
So I didn't have any familiarity at all with the education system in Senegal, but before I left for my trip, I was able to meet with Lauren, who I don't think she's here right now, but she works for the Berkeley Center and had actually done previous research with ONEX. So she was able to direct me to a lot of really helpful publications and background reading that prepared me a lot for the trip. So speaking to people who had either traveled to that country before or who had done similar research was the most helpful thing.
Yeah, similarly, I didn't have any experience with, or I didn't know anything about Seoul University or even the education system in South Korea before I left. So I did some research here. I met with an individual from Georgetown Library. I would suggest doing that because for me, what was very challenging is I couldn't necessarily even do a local internet search because I don't have like the Korean key or even know how to do that anyway. But anyway, so he was able to really help me out with that and lead me to a couple of journal articles that were immensely helpful, which actually led me to be able to see the video Ghosts of Jeju before I left. So that was really, I mean, through that whole process was really how I was able to even learn about the issue at hand before going over, and it was immensely helpful.
Great, thank you. I know we have both parents and professors in the audience, so I'd love to hear from anybody else. Professor Wesley Nero, please.
Hi, I'm just wondering if you had any assumptions about your research or research outcomes that maybe were questioned or that you had to rethink, even maybe assumptions you didn't realize you had until you got to the moment during your research that you had to rethink.
That's a great question. For me, I'd say the number one assumption that I know I was very wrong about was the language issue, and so that was something that I had to address on the fly. But as far as the actual topic, I think when I was going to Sogong, knowing that it was a Catholic university, I assumed that there would be a lot of similarities with Georgetown, and there definitely were, but there was definitely a lot of differences too. And I think if I were going there again, I would try to go in with, not trying to apply any of the Georgetown Jesuit principles that did show up, but just going in with an open mind, knowing that they might approach things differently or even say things differently than we do here.
Anybody else?
I'll keep thinking.
Yeah, so one of the things that really surprised me going in was kind of disparity and difference between the central campus and the rural campuses. So the central campus of the Universidad Rafael Landívar is a lot like Georgetown in the sense that the students are around our age and they're much better off than the students in the rural campus. And I guess I didn't really understand how big that difference would be, but the students of the rural campuses are usually later 20s or mid to late 20s, and some of them have a family, and it's a much different demographic. And so it was interesting to me to find out how different that can be, students who are nominally at the same university but have different lifestyles.
One assumption that I went to Canada with was that it was going to be just like America, and it was, but it also wasn't. Simply because when I think of a diverse population, I don't necessarily think of the various perspectives that they might be giving. Just on surface level, you might be thinking of the clothing that someone wears, or the food that they eat, or the books that they read when they were younger, or the religion, or the language that they speak. And so having just kind of that surface level understanding of culture, and this experience definitely made me think a lot deeper about the way that culture affects who you are as an individual and the identity that you have, simply because I would go to a school and ask about the mission statement or the purpose and how all of that involves culture. And I asked something, I think, with an Ojibwe language teacher, like, how is culture present in your classroom specifically? And she said, well, culture is like air that you breathe. Like, it's something that you just do. Like, she didn't know how to answer my question. I said, okay, well, now I don't know what your answer is, but I completely understand it even if I don't know how to articulate it. And so that was just one assumption that I had of looking for the wrong aspect of culture or having the wrong definition of culture. Was something that was just very, very different than I had expected. And it was very eye-opening and very personally fulfilling at the time, as well as made me change my entire research question a little bit. But I think it turned out a lot better, so it was great. Did you think it was okay?
So the research question I had originally thought of doing was actually looking at gender inequality in the Catholic education system and looking at ways that that system was trying to reduce the gender gap. But after doing more research and actually talking with people in Senegal, I realized that female students actually outnumber male students in a lot of the Catholic schools in Dakar, at least. And that isn't to say that there isn't a problem of gender inequality in Senegal, because there absolutely is a lot of progress to be made, especially in the rural areas and especially in terms of higher education. But I realized I had made a lot of assumptions about gender norms and inequalities and behaviors that weren't necessarily the case. And after doing more research, I realized I was actually a lot more interested in looking at interreligious dynamics instead.
Great, thanks. How about one more question and then we'll, or maybe two, and then we can talk freely. Dr. Gillespie.
I was just wondering if people had questions for you as students, as researchers. Really curious about you.
Yeah, actually, people had a lot of questions about me as a student at a Catholic university in the United States. So they had a lot of assumptions about what life was like as a student at a Catholic university, and they were very surprised to learn that I'm actually Muslim and not Christian, because they assumed that all students at Georgetown would be Christian. So they were very interested in learning about religious dynamics at Georgetown University, so it was very exciting to be able to talk about that with them.
Yeah, for me, a lot of questions were also about my experience at Georgetown and what Georgetown is like, especially with it being a Jesuit institution. And so they wondered if I took a lot of theology classes, a lot of philosophy classes, kind of how much religion played into a part of the university, because to them it affects their lives in various ways. And so they were very interested in that, coming from what they recognized was a very good institution in the United States and knew it was Jesuit as well, how much that impacted it.
The questions I received were also about my experience at Georgetown, but a bit more educational. So what I was interested in studying, why I was interested in going to a small part of Canada to learn about this Native community, these Native populations, as well as my future aspirations in education or my interests in the field and what that might look like.
I similarly had a lot of questions that were just asking about what life is like on Georgetown's campus. I thought it was very interesting that the only people that tended to actually ask me questions back were the students that I interviewed. A lot of the adult interviewees would not really ask me any questions. I'm not sure if that's something culturally or if that's just something I'd experienced here in America too. But one of the questions that I do starkly remember from one of my interviews was, as I really covered in my report, Sogong is one of the leaders in Korea of providing education and being able to assist those who have disabilities, specifically physical disabilities. So I interviewed one student who had physical disabilities, and after we were done with our interview, he wanted to know all about the services that Georgetown provides for students with disabilities, because he wondered if in other areas, specifically those in America, if the students' needs are met. So that was very cool.
That's a good question. Matt, I'll give you the last question.
Thank you. Thanks again for sharing your experiences with us. Curious to learn a little bit about how the experience affected your personal, professional, or academic goals, how you've applied your experience since returning to campus.
Great question to end on. Thanks. Dana's a junior, so she gets a little more time.
Yeah, I can start. We can go down. Me again. So my experience with cultural education in Canada definitely made me think more on a systems level, and the way that, and Sabrina wasn't here, I was like, ding, I taught her that last semester. Sorry, but definitely thinking about the way that a larger system affects education on a personal level, or for individuals, or for smaller communities. So thinking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for all of Canada, the way that that impacts individual students in one classroom, or the way that access to a youth justice program can influence one student or one smaller community, or even access to transportation. We actually picked up a hitchhiking student who was just going back and forth between his school on the island and his reservation, which was in Sudbury, which was an hour away from where I was staying in Espanola, which was an hour and a half away from the island. And so even just some of the resources and the kind of overlapping systems that prevent students and communities from having all the resources that they need to succeed, and focusing on that more in my educational experiences, as well as my potential future aspirations or positions in the industry.
Yeah, so I'm a senior. I don't know what I'm doing yet next year, but the fellowship was instructive, and I think the way it was most instructive was in showing how much really experience in the communities you want to work with is important. And so it's easy, you're able to do research ahead of time about the area. I was able to do a lot of it, but really the time there was the most instructive, and seeing how people live and talking to the people is the most instructive. And 3 weeks was some time, but it would have been great to be there for longer and really to understand the issues better and to recognize what people are going through more. You need to spend more time. And so really is learning the communities and experiencing them is the most important thing.
Yeah, I think this opportunity was definitely very helpful in terms of thinking about my career path. So I knew I had been interested in research before doing this. This was obviously part of the reason why I applied for it. But after doing the project, it really did confirm my interest in research and potentially doing research as a career. And so I learned a lot about how you do have to rely on other people to help you with that, and it's definitely not something that you can do as a solo project. Like Nico said, you do have to talk to other people in the community, as well as people who have also done research in a similar field that you have to get their insight as well.
Thank you for your question. I think I'd echo their sentiments in the sense that I know that now, after having experienced how enriching it is to go to a different culture and be able to live with them, how much better you're able to understand where they're coming from after going through those experiences. But I think the other thing that I really learned from this, as demonstrated by the protesters at Gangdong Village, is a lesson about dedication, and just being able to see that for 9 years, their entire lives have been dedicated to this cause that they really believe in. And that was very inspiring to see, and I'm not exactly sure, I'm only a junior, I'm not sure if I'll know this by the time I'm a senior either, but I'm not sure what I'm going to go into, but just knowing that, being able to see that, being able to see how inspiring it is for a group of people to be able to put every ounce of their being, every ounce of their day into something that they believe in, that was pretty powerful.
Great, thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, guys. I just want to close by emphasizing that these aren't isolated research projects. They're very much interwoven, tied together. We stay in touch in really fascinating ways with these communities, and I know you all will too. And some of the previous fellows continue to stay in touch years afterwards, going back, doing service projects, and people from their community. So many of your people, some of them we knew before, some we're going to work with moving forward. I just think it's an amazing example of a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I was actually writing this for something else to remind me, but in 1963, he was in jail, and he said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny." And these projects really remind me of that, just the web that we're all in together, that you went into this work, you'll always have these ties with these people, as will we at Georgetown, and it will really continue. So it's really important work. We're all very moved to have heard your stories, and just really thank you for the effort you put in over a year. Really proud of you. Thank you.
One more round of applause. Thank you so much, researchers. We welcome everybody to stay and perhaps prepare our researchers with even more questions. But a huge thank you to everybody who came out in the audience, parents, professors, students, family members. We really appreciate you being here to hear from our student researchers tonight. So thank you so much. Get home safe.
Thank you.